And we're now going to move on to the next statement. Statement by the Vice President on Nagorno-Karabakh. Somebody is speaking.
Let me start by saying I'm very glad that we have this debate tonight. This was the situation in the Nagorno-Karabakh was one of probably the center of my talks, both in Armenia and Azerbaijan, when I was visiting there last month, when I was looking at last time that this issue was discussed in this plenary. That was in 2011. So I'm really glad that this Parliament, as far as I understand, for the first time in plenary, this Parliament faces this. And I think it is going to be very helpful and useful, because events in the Nagorno-Karabakh are another reminder of how dangerous a protracted conflict can be. Just days before the latest and unprecedented escalation, we had cautioned from our side that the status quo was unsustainable. From a tense situation to large-scale hostilities, that can be a very short step. For this reason, we are increasing our efforts towards a settlement of the conflict. It has already inflicted too much suffering. It continues to pose a threat to regional security in our neighbourhood, and it is an obstacle towards the development of both countries and of the entire region. The South Caucasus is a crucial region for Europe. It lays at the crossroads between Europe, Asia and the Middle East. It holds a huge potential for growth, but such a potential is held back by instability and war. And again, this came out very clearly in my recent talks in both capitals. A large-scale conflict is not in the interest of anyone and can lead nowhere. This conflict hinders the development and the stability of the two countries, of their neighbours and their rapprochement with the European Union. As you know, at the beginning of April, the violence surged to a level that was unprecedented since the ceasefire agreement in 1994. We have seen reports, we have all seen them, about the use of heavy weapons, large numbers of casualties, including among the civilian population. And statements from Baku and Yerevan make clear that we have serious dangers if the situation is not quickly calmed. Immediately on April 2nd, I called on the parties to stop the fighting and observe the ceasefire, to show restraint and avoid any further actions or statements that could result in escalation. I have reiterated support to the OSCE Minsk Group and the three co-chairs as the internationally agreed format for the settlement of this conflict. The EU Special Representative for the South Caucasus, Herbert Salber, took immediate contact with the parties and he kept these contacts regularly. I had myself constructive separate conversations with the foreign ministers of Armenia and of Azerbaijan. I will keep in contact with them also in the coming days and in the coming weeks, and our Special Representative is visiting the region exactly this week. Let me add that I hope that you can contribute to our efforts with your own parliamentary contacts. As you know, I believe very much in parliamentary diplomacy, both to your fellow parliamentarians, but also with civil society organisations. We all know the way ahead. The escalation makes it even more clear that the conflict does not have a military solution. Developments on the ground demand that we stay vigilant and continue to insist on the strict observance of the ceasefire and on moving forward in the peace process. Especially targeting civilians must stop. But obviously we cannot settle for the status quo. A political solution is what is needed, and our political goal must be that the sides resume negotiations on a comprehensive settlement of the conflict. The Minsk Group and its co-chairs are there to further mediate, and the EU has supported a settlement on the basis of the Madrid principles proposed by the co-chairs. But ultimately, we know well the solution is in the hands of the parties to this conflict. They need to be ready to make meaningful compromises towards peace. In parallel with observing the ceasefire and engaging in negotiations, it is necessary to create an environment that is conducive to progress. Actions and statements which could further complicate the already complex environment have to stop. The European Union fully supports measures that can help. For instance, the repatriation of the bodies of dead soldiers to their families. I am encouraged by the mechanism that has been put in place in recent days by the ICRC and the OSCE. We will need also new efforts that can accompany the political process. This includes, among other things, enhanced security measures such as the OSCE proposed mechanism for investigation into the ceasefire violations, and this is a mechanism the European Union has endorsed. The EU, complementing the efforts of the Minsk Group co-chairs, has for several years now supported activities that facilitate peaceful contacts between people across the conflict divide. Today this work is more important than ever. The conflict settlement will also continue to be part of the EU contacts and dialogue with Armenia and Azerbaijan as partner countries, as well as with key international stakeholders. And as I said, this was at the centre of our talks when I visited a month ago both countries. After this tragic outburst of violence, talking about negotiations and trust, I know well, might sound out of place. It is not. Actually, it is the only rational thing to do. The alternative to negotiations would be more death and more destruction. Everyone now understands that the status quo can only lead to more violence, and this is exactly what happened. Let us not underestimate the dangers of this conflict, and let us turn the current situation into an opportunity towards peace. Thank you.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you very much. Now the group speakers, beginning with Mr. Preda for 1 minute on behalf of the EPP Group.
The recent events in Nagorno-Karabakh show once again that the big problem of the so-called frozen conflicts is that they can become hot at any moment. Last week, this unfreezing led to 60 dead people within 4 days. Now things seem to have gone back to what used to be normalcy in Nagorno-Karabakh, a fragile ceasefire agreement established some 22 years ago. Unfortunately, in the former Soviet space, such frozen conflicts are quite numerous: Transnistria, Abkhazia, Southern Ossetia, and more recently Eastern Ukraine. All of these conflicts, unsolved conflicts, have a common point: Russia's interest to keep them as such. For the Russian Federation, they are levers by which it is trying to control its neighbors. In the case of Nagorno-Karabakh, Russia plays two hands. On the one hand, an outspoken ally of Armenia, but on the other hand, it sells weaponry to Azerbaijan as well.
Yes, it was a minute. Mr. Bostinaru, 1.5 minutes on behalf of the S&D Group.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Dear Madam High Representative, Vice President of the European Commission. The conflict of about 10 days ago shouldn't be underestimated. Despite the very little information that managed to escape from the authorities' control, this was a real large-scale military confrontation which left hundreds dead or wounded on both sides, including civilians. The ceasefire announced on 5 April seems to hold for the moment, but we have to face the reality. After more than 20 years, we have no political solution for this frozen conflict, but rather a serious aggravation. We call on both sides to show restraint and stop confrontation. We also call on the establishment of the OSCE of a real mechanism to monitor the ceasefire in order to avoid another escalation and a large-scale military confrontation with the risk of involvement of external actors. It's important that OSCE Minsk Group action is revitalized in order to bring the two sides back to the negotiations. And at the same time, it's fundamental to see that Europe is playing a more active role by using more for more, having in mind the particular relations we have with Armenia and with Azerbaijan. Before I conclude, let me also add that we are considering the region as so important, and having in mind the EU leverage, it will be important to reflect the viable solution so that you cannot simply support the Minsk Group but also play an active role within it. Thank you. Merci pour votre patience, Madame la Présidente.
Non, mais j'avais là encore une...
Thank you very much. I wanted you to stick to time and speak more slowly. Of course, there's two things that are difficult to reconcile. Mr. Tannock.
The 1994 war ended. We are sadly all too familiar with the occasional recurrence of hostilities, particularly sniper activity along the line of contact. This most recent offensive is, however, quite unprecedented and appears to have been a full-scale mobilisation of Azerbaijani forces across the entire line in an attempt to retake territory with many casualties. I am pleased that the ceasefire is holding, and I encourage an immediate return to the negotiating table under the auspices of the Minsk process. The use of advanced Russian weaponry by Azeri forces such as the Smerch rocket launchers shows us that the policies of Putin are once again at play in his so-called spheres of influence. We must also bear in mind the prevailing low oil price and the domestic effects that this is having on Aliyev's strategy to create an external military diversion. In a week in which populism triumphed diplomacy in the Dutch referendum concerning Ukraine's free trade agreement, we should be reminded of the very real potential for destabilisation on our borders if we are unable to act in a cohesive and coordinated way in Europe. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur Tannock.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tannock. For 1 minute and 30 seconds, Mr. Ostravicius for the ALDE.
Madam Chair, Madam High Representative, colleagues, all experts agree that if escalated further, Nagorno-Karabakh conflict would certainly be far more lethal and ruthless than it was 2 decades ago. And those who ordered recent escalations can't hide from history. Unprecedented arms race by both sides in conflict that is for a number of years boosted by one major arms supplier, Russia. Bloody money, billions of dollars, is pouring into the Russian budget. Vice Prime Minister of Russia has recently said the following about the Russian arms supplies. I quote, "Everything is according to contracts. Both countries are strategic partners to us." End of quote. For me, the question is, what we, as the EU, do in order to deal with so-called frozen conflict and with destructive dominance of Russia in the region. Have we, as the EU, have ever asked for our legitimate place behind the negotiating table what is supposed to deal with the conflict? And indeed, the argument from '94, when the Minsk group was set up and the EU was not considered as a global player and mediator, is not valid any longer. Let's be back to the table of negotiations as a global player. Let's play a role as a major negotiator and mediator in this conflict. And let's prove the Eastern Partnership goals to support peace and stability next door are valid. Thank you.
Thank you. 1 minute for the GUE. Mr. Juarez de Bounds.
Thank you, Madam President. The election observation mission in Nagorno-Karabakh led a number of colleagues to see that there were people there living in democracy with the independence of the judiciary, freedom of expression and so on. People with a monstrous past faced a future of stability and peace, even if they weren't recognised by the international community. I think that their future lies on recognition of the right to self-determination. If that is respected and recognised, there will be peace and stability. On the course towards that, Armenia and Azerbaijan must accept a mechanism for investigating the flouting of the ceasefire under the terms of the Minsk agreement. Without that, they will continue to accuse one another of the resumption of hostilities. We need an ongoing peacekeeping effort in Nagorno-Karabakh.
Thank you. 1.5 minutes for the Greens. Mrs. Hautala.
The only way to prevent a new outbreak of war around the line of contact and to de-escalate the situation is to stop the military build-up and the relevant arms race. The best way to achieve this is to deploy a robust UN peacekeeping mission around the line of contact with the demilitarisation of the area and the withdrawal of all heavy armaments 15 to 30 kilometers away. The parties in the framework of the OSCE Minsk group should develop and agree to an incident prevention and investigation mechanism where to address all the eventual violations. Nagorno-Karabakh differs from the other frozen conflicts in one point. Both parties agree that most of the conflict area belongs to Azerbaijan, and I'm talking about the 7 provinces surrounding Nagorno-Karabakh. Armenia, therefore, should give back to Azerbaijan most of the occupied provinces within a reasonable fixed delay. And at the same time, the OSCE Minsk Group presidency should relaunch the negotiations on the final status of Nagorno-Karabakh. President, instead of exchanging accusations against each other on eventual war crimes committed in Nagorno-Karabakh, Armenia and Azerbaijan should both sign and ratify the Rome Statute on the International Criminal Court. Armenia has signed but not ratified. Azerbaijan neither signed nor ratified. And finally, the EU should apply the same approach to all the conflicts in the Eastern Partnership countries, avoiding double standards.
Pour 1 minute 30 également.
1.5 minutes, Mr. Arnett, on behalf of the EFDD.
Madam President, Madam Commissioner, there is much, I think, that we can agree on in responding to this situation. It is tragic that a ceasefire which has lasted, in general, so well since the mid-1990s should fall apart so rapidly decades later. It reminds us, I hope, of the precariousness of peace and the horrors of conflict. And though maybe we disagree on the role that these institutions should play, maybe I see the United Nations as more important and not the European Union, you are certainly correct in suggesting that it is our responsibility to do whatever we can. All nations, and indeed the United Nations, must make urgent representations to ensure that basic things like civilians not being targeted are respected. It is vital too that those simple measures like repatriation of bodies actually happen, not because in and of themselves that those things change anything, but because perhaps they provide a focal point from which peace can build, a way of trust to begin to build up. There is, I believe, a ray of hope that another precarious ceasefire has begun. Long may that last, and may it last much longer than the 2 decades that the previous one did.
Merci.
Thank you very much. Now, on behalf of the NF Group, Mr. Chaposer, for 1 minute. Madam High Representative, dear colleagues, once again, our diplomacy based on human rights, which is slightly unreal, is being caught up on by the real world. In Nagorno-Karabakh, 80% of the population is Armenian, and it was Stalin, the Commissioner of Nationalities, who incorporated the cradle of Armenia, into the USSR and into Azerbaijan. And then we have seen, at the same time, territories being incorporated into Ukraine, also by Stalin. You now, Madam High Representative, are asking to kickstart the peace process. In other words, European diplomacy is being left to the member states, and that's good. As to regards to Russia, if you look at Erdogan, the satrap, he's the one who finances terrorism and who is blackmailing Europe, and we've given into it, and that is a disgrace.
Stettina pour 1 minute, je comprends, mais ne criez pas.
Mr. Stettina, 1 minute.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor, Mrs. Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, let me explain why for many years I have been supporting Armenia in its territorial dispute concerning Nagorno-Karabakh. It was the Bolshevik Soviet Union which artificially, back in the 20th, assigned the Karabakh territory to Azerbaijan according to the divide and rule principle. Not to support Karabakh and Armenia in their struggle, as far as I'm concerned, would mean to endorse the brutal nationalistic Soviet policy of that time. Let me point to the fact that the Minsk Group co-chairs are calling on presidents of Armenia and Azerbaijan to accept the investigative OSCE mechanism on ceasefire violations. Without this mechanism, both parties will continue mutually accusing one another from initiating attacks at the line of contact on the Azerbaijani-Armenian border. Armenia agrees to discuss details of this mechanism, and OSCE is now calling on Azerbaijan to do the same.
Monsieur Liberatsky.
Thank you. Mr. Liberatsky for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, President. High Representative, thank you very much for your presentation of the crux of the matter. We should be aware we are debating the situation of a country of 150,000 people. A small country, a defenseless one. The budget of Nagorno-Karabakh is equivalent to 2 or 3 rockets that can be launched against that country at any moment. So dialogue, striving for peace, building of mutual understanding. And we should put pressure on Armenia and Azerbaijan. We shouldn't be blaming Russia alone for exporting arms, because both neighbors of Nagorno-Karabakh have weapons already, but we should be pressuring both Russia and Turkey, because only peace and tranquility will allow us to implement the Minsk agreements. Thank you.
Monsieur Jambatsky.
1 minute, Mr. Jambatsky.
Chair, Mrs. Mogherini, dear colleagues, for the nth time we are witnessing skirmishes in Nagorno-Karabakh. On the 33 people died and 200 were injured on the 1st and 2nd of April. About a little before the anniversary of the Armenian genocide, again the Azerbaijani opened fire against the Armenians. On the 26th of September 2015, the co-chairs of the Organization for Security in Europe called upon the two presidents to build a mechanism for a ceasefire. As you see, there is no such mechanism, and the reason is the refusal of Azerbaijan. The European Union should have a clear position. It is not acceptable that a strategic partner of the European Union cannot trample on human rights and have acts of violence. Azerbaijan only received the support of Turkey, and its only purpose is to fight Armenian people. Thank you for your attention.
Monsieur Engel, 1 minute.
Mr. Engel, 1 minute.
Madame la Présidente, the status quo will only lead to more violence. That may be so, but it's only so for one specific reason, and that is that Azerbaijan remains an aggressor today, like it was an aggressor 24 years ago. It has violated the ceasefire this time, just like it kept violating the ceasefire on lower scale for a very long period of time, and it does so because it is convinced that everything and everyone Armenian in this region must disappear. Now, this is the reason why it has never accepted anything the Minsk group has been able to propose, because anything that it can propose is compromise, and Azerbaijan does not want to compromise, just like the Armenians do not want to compromise any longer with a country that elevates Ramil Safarov to the level of national hero. A brutal ex-murderer reverted to the country by Hungary as it should never have happened. The only thing that will eventually happen in this case is to recognize the independence of Nagorno-Karabakh. It was declared in full accordance with the Soviet constitution applicable at the time. It was never accepted. It is time to do so now.
Merci, Monsieur Christea.
Mr. Christea, 1 minute.
Merci. This month's escalation in the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict is not only deeply worrying, but simply unacceptable for 2 reasons. Firstly, because it took a toll that will always be too high and we can never get used to and tolerate: the loss of innocent lives. Secondly, because what we are witnessing is not only the latest violation of the ceasefire, but also the gravest since the agreement signed in 1994. I feel that today calling for restraint and the cessation of hostilities is no longer enough, and quite frankly, 22 years too late. The review of the ENP put stabilisation as the main political priority. It is time for the EU to complement strategically the efforts of the OSCE Minsk group. and it is also time for the Russian Federation to contribute genuinely to peace. How can an OSCE co-chair be a peace broker and at the same time the main arms provider to both countries?
Merci.
Thank you very much. 1 minute, Mr. Karim.
President, may I start as chair of the South Caucasus delegation in echoing your very words that you spoke today. It is far too easy to take a position and apportion blame. You have not done so, and I will seek not to do so as well. And what happened is actually no surprise. The situation was unsustainable and bore the inherent danger of resumption of hostilities, and what happened was bound to take place. My message to my Armenian friends is that the status quo is not in your interests, not in the short term, not in the long term. My message to my Azeri friends, with whom we hope to resume interparliamentary dialogue: the fact you are frustrated with the situation does not mean the OSCE long protracted confidence building measures are superfluous. If only to prevent an accidental escalation, you can help in this respect. And my message to both: you are the ones that have the primary responsibility to find reasonable compromises based on international law. There is no external actor that can do this in your place, certainly not the one that is selling both of you bullets.
Madame Manescu.
Thank you, Mrs. Manescu. 1 minute.
Mulțumesc, doamnă președinte.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Vice President, allow me to thank you for the constant involvement in mediating conflicts, and let me express my concern over the escalation of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict and the daily drama for people who live in the region. It is clear that a sustainable solution can exist only after stopping the use of armed forces and coming back to the peace negotiating table. In accordance with the resolutions of the European Parliament starting with 2010 and up to 2015, the parties involved in the conflict have the obligation to start a process of negotiation in the terms decided by the OSCE group in Minsk, putting an end to violence, immediate withdrawal of military forces from the occupied territories, observance of the territorial integrity, equal rights for the population, the right of those who have left their homes to go back, and accepting an international peace mission in the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Zala. 1 minute.
Colleagues, I am not going to speak about the recent situation on the ground. Nobody is able to detect the real truth. Every side has its own. For the EU, 2 aspects are crucial. First, the principle of sovereignty and territorial integrity. Based on these principles, the EU can play a really game-changing role. Second, I don't believe on Minsk Group, but I believe the EU, in the person of the High Representative, has capacity to broker the negotiations. I am absolutely sure that the picture and possibility of the independence, the hope of all South Caucasus countries to determine their fate independently, without meddling of super and less superpowers from outside, is a good starting point for that big task to broker the final peace arrangement. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Theocharous for 1 minute. Thank you, Madam President. We need to impose sanctions on Baku for the new attack on the people of Nagorno-Karabakh. The people of Nagorno-Karabakh have been resisting for 60 years to Soviet authoritarianism, and they're now being bullied by the regime in Azerbaijan. And we know where the solution lies. It's incumbent on the EU to support the people of Nagorno-Karabakh who are only fighting for their freedom. And they cannot be simply left to an unfair status quo. We must see recognition of Nagorno-Karabakh and sanctions on Azerbaijan, because they'll bring peace very close. Thank you very much. Now, catch the eye, beginning with Mr. Kukan, who has 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Cheers. I think that in the current situation in Nagorno-Karabakh region, we should strive to stop the violence because in the immediate neighborhood it is dangerous, and the escalation of this conflict can have serious repercussions in the entire region. As a rapporteur for the neighbourhood policy, I advise to be more active in the eastern neighbourhood, which remains affected by both active armed conflicts and frozen, protracted conflicts. The situation in Nagorno-Karabakh shows that we must keep working more actively towards a sustainable and peaceful solution. Now, the cessation of hostilities and upholding the truce remain of utmost importance. We need to help our partners, both in Azerbaijan and Armenia, to strive for a peaceful solution. Paraphrasing Tom de Waal, we need, I quote, to solve the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict before it explodes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Mr. Mavridis has 1 minute.
I think that Madam Vice President Mogherini has made it very clear by stating that the military confrontation does not offer a political solution to the problem. However, I think we should stress the importance that the co-chairs of the Minsk group called both Armenia and Azerbaijan to accept a mechanism to investigate ceasefire violations, as has already been stated by some of my colleagues. Without such a mechanism, the sides will continue to blame each other for initiating the attacks, and also we're going to have loss of lives. Armenia has agreed to discuss the details of setting the mechanism. Azerbaijan has not so far. So it's one thing to be neutral, but it's another thing to be impartial. That's why, without this mechanism in place, with the mechanism in place, some lives on both sides could have been saved. Thank you.
Merci. Monsieur Jurek.
Thank you very much. Mr. Jurek, 1 minute.
La Presidente, 99 lat.
99 years ago, Pope Benedict XV, when he presented his adhortation on peace, he called to finish war massacres and then guarantee security for Armenia. We both know how much this nation has suffered throughout history. I'm not talking about the Armenian genocide alone, which took place over 100 years ago. I'm talking about dramatic origins of Armenian independence during the late 80s and early 90s. Armenia has a special right to secure borders. Armenian population in Nagorno-Karabakh is also entitled to security. We must not forget them. We know under what great pressure Armenia found itself when Russia required them to join the Russian-led Eurasian Union. We are obliged to remember them. The more present we are there, the more we'll be able to support the security of Armenia. Thank you. Thank you very much. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very happy to see you now tonight. I will now give the floor to High Representative Mogherini.
Thank you. I would like to... Can I go on? Thanks. I would like to, first of all, reiterate what I've heard by many of you in the room, that our support to this process, trying to find the most reasonable way to make it restart and proceed in the right way, is essential. And I would like to echo Mr. Karim's words that I find very wise, that we are there to facilitate to help, to accompany, to try and find the sustainable solution and the sustainable compromise, but at the end of the day, only the political will of the parties themselves will move things towards a peaceful settlement. And this is also part of our effort. When I say creating the conducive environment or trying to avoid that environment is disruptive is also part of our job. I take all your comments on board for our work, for the work of our special representative that is daily and nightly dedicated to this, as I said, with visits in the region in this week, and obviously staying ready to also increasingly engage in these efforts as will be necessary, if necessary, in the future. Thank you.
Grazie tante. Bardzo dziękuję pani.
Thank you very much, Madam Commissioner.